The moment Donald Trump returned to the White House, something fundamental shifted in how the rest of the world calculates power. For decades, American economic leverage rested on a simple premise: the dollar as the global reserve currency, backed by military might and institutional control over trade systems. But what we're witnessing now isn't just resistance to Trump's tariff threats or his transactional diplomacy. It's a structural realignment that's been building quietly for years, accelerated by sanctions, weaponized finance, and the kind of economic coercion that eventually forces nations to find alternatives. Leaders across the global south, joined by major economies like China, Russia, and increasingly the European Union, are announcing coordinated mechanisms to bypass dollar-denominated trade. We're talking about currency swap agreements, alternative payment systems, and regional trade blocs that don't require New York banks or Washington's approval. This isn't about ideology or hurt feelings. It's about survival and sovereignty in an era where your financial infrastructure can be shut off overnight if you fall out of favor with American foreign policy. The system that emerged from Bretton Woods, the one that gave the United States extraordinary power to print money while others had to earn it, is facing its first genuine challenge since World War II. Let's understand what's actually happening here, because the mainstream media will tell you this is about Trump, about his personality, about his rhetoric, but that's only scratching the surface. What we're seeing is the consequence of decades of American economic policy that treated the entire world as a subordinate system, a network of countries that existed primarily to serve American corporate interests and American geopolitical objectives. And Trump, in his own chaotic way, has simply accelerated a process that was already underway. The process of other nations realizing that their economic sovereignty, their ability to feed their people, to build their infrastructure, to chart their own course, was being held hostage by a financial architecture that was designed in a different era for a different purpose. Think about what it means when the United States can simply decide unilaterally that a country can no longer access the SWIFT banking system. SWIFT is the messaging network that allows banks around the world to communicate and transfer money. It's technically a Belgian organization, but let's be honest about who controls it. When Washington decides that Iran, or Russia, or Venezuela has stepped out of line, it can effectively cut that country off from the global financial system. Businesses can't get paid. Hospitals can't import medicine. Regular people, who have nothing to do with whatever political dispute sparked the sanctions, suddenly find their life savings inaccessible or worthless. This is economic warfare, and it's been the preferred tool of American foreign policy for the past 30 years because it's cleaner than bombs. It doesn't produce the kind of images that turn public opinion, but it's devastatingly effective at bringing countries to their knees. But here's what the architects of this system didn't fully anticipate. When you weaponize the dollar, when you turn the global financial infrastructure into an instrument of coercion, you give every other country in the world an overwhelming incentive to build an alternative. It's not about ideology anymore. It's not about whether you love America or hate America. It's about basic risk management. If you're a finance minister in Brazil or South Africa or Indonesia, you're looking at what happened to Russia after 2022 and you're thinking, we could be next. One policy disagreement, one election that Washington doesn't like, one assertion of our own national interest that conflicts with American priorities, and suddenly we're frozen out of the system that our economy depends on. So what are these leaders announcing? They're announcing what amounts to a parallel financial architecture. China and Russia have been working on this for over a decade. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, is China's alternative to SWIFT. It's been growing steadily, quietly, processing more transactions every year. Russia, after being hit with sanctions in 2014 following Crimea, developed its own system for transfer of financial messages, SPFS. These weren't created because Russian and Chinese leaders woke up one day and decided to be difficult. They were created out of necessity, out of the recognition that relying on a system controlled by a geopolitical rival is an unacceptable vulnerability. And now we're seeing the expansion of this project. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have been discussing a common currency for trade settlement. This doesn't mean they're creating a new dollar or a new euro that replaces domestic currencies. What it means is that when Brazil sells soybeans to China, or when India buys oil from Russia, They can settle that transaction in their own currencies or in a mutually agreed upon unit of account without converting everything to dollars first. Every time that happens, it's one less transaction that requires dollar liquidity, one less opportunity for American financial institutions to take their cut, one less point of leverage for Washington. The numbers here are staggering when you step back and look at them. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has been declining steadily from about 70% in 2000 to closer to 58% today. That might not sound dramatic, but in the world of reserve currencies, that's a massive shift, and it's accelerating. Countries are diversifying into euros, into yen, into yuan, into gold, anything that reduces their dependence on the dollar system. And with each percentage point that shifts away from the dollar, America's ability to run massive trade deficits without consequence diminishes. The entire American economic model since the 1970s has depended on the rest of the world's willingness to hold dollars and dollar-denominated assets. That willingness is no longer guaranteed. Let's talk about what this means in concrete terms, because abstract discussions of reserve currencies can feel distant from people's daily lives. The United States has been able to maintain a standard of living that exceeds its productive capacity because the rest of the world has been willing to sell us real goods, electronics, clothing, machinery, oil, in exchange for dollars that we can print. We've been able to run government deficits that would destroy other countries' currencies because there's always been demand for treasury bonds from foreign central banks that need to hold dollar reserves. We've been able to keep interest rates lower than our debt levels would normally allow because of this constant inflow of capital from abroad. All of that rests on the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. When that role erodes, the entire equation changes. Suddenly, the United States has to compete for capital on the same terms as everyone else. Interest rates have to rise to attract foreign investment. The government's borrowing costs increase. Inflation becomes harder to control because we can't just export it to the rest of the world anymore. The trade deficit, which has been sustainable because we pay for it with currency we create, becomes unsustainable. These aren't abstract economic concerns. They translate directly into living standards, into whether social programs can be funded, into whether infrastructure gets built or crumbles, into the price of everything from gasoline to groceries. And Trump's approach, this aggressive America First posture, the tariffs and the threats and the transactional bullying, it's accelerating the very process that undermines American power. Because every time he threatens a country with economic consequences for not complying with American demands, he reminds that country's leaders why they need an alternative system. Every time he tweets about weaponizing the dollar or cutting off aid or imposing sanctions, he's essentially advertising the risk of dollar dependence to the rest of the world. He's making the case for de-dollarization more effectively than any Chinese or Russian diplomat ever could. The irony is profound. Trump and his supporters talk constantly about making America great again, about restoring American power, about forcing the world to respect us. But the methods they're using, the unilateral sanctions, the withdrawal from international agreements, the contempt for multilateral institutions, the weaponization of trade and finance, these are the very things that are causing other countries to build systems that don't include us. They're creating the conditions for American decline while claiming to prevent it. It's like trying to keep friends by threatening them constantly and then wondering why they stop inviting you to gatherings. What we're seeing announced now is the formalization and expansion of these alternative arrangements. Saudi Arabia, which has been tied to the dollar since the 1970s through the petrodollar system, is now accepting yuan for oil sales to China. That's enormous. The entire logic of the petrodollar was that oil, being priced in dollars globally, created automatic demand for dollars from every country that needed energy. If that system breaks down, if oil can be purchased in multiple currencies, the structural demand for dollars drops significantly. And once Saudi Arabia opens that door, other oil producers follow. The UAE is exploring similar arrangements. Russia is obviously selling its energy in rubles and yuan. Even smaller producers are looking at diversification. The Gulf states, these absolute monarchies that have been American allies for decades, are now hedging their bets in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. They're joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as dialogue partners. They're investing in Chinese infrastructure projects. They're developing closer military ties with Russia. This isn't because they've suddenly developed anti-American sentiment. It's because they're looking at the shifting balance of power in the world and making rational calculations about where their interests lie. They see China as the world's largest energy consumer. They see the Belt and Road Initiative creating new trade routes that bypass American-controlled sea lanes, and they see Washington's increasingly erratic and unreliable behavior, and they're adjusting accordingly. In Latin America, the same dynamic is playing out. Countries that have lived under American economic domination for over a century, that have seen their democracies overthrown when they elected leaders Washington didn't like, that have been forced to open their markets and privatize their resources and adopt neoliberal policies that benefited American corporations while devastating their own populations, these countries are finally seeing an opportunity to break free. They're forming regional trade agreements that don't require dollar settlement. They're nationalizing resources that were previously controlled by foreign companies. They're defaulting on IMF loans and finding alternative sources of financing from Chinese development banks that, whatever their own problems and strings attached, at least don't come with the same history of colonial exploitation. The African continent is particularly interesting in this regard. For decades, African countries have been trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency, borrowing dollars to finance development, seeing their currencies devalue, being forced to adopt structural adjustment programs that gutted social spending and public services, all while their natural resources flowed out to enrich corporations headquartered in New York and London and Paris. China's approach, building infrastructure in exchange for resource access and long-term partnerships, whatever its flaws, at least offers something tangible. Roads get built. Ports get constructed. Railways connect regions that were previously isolated. And the financing doesn't come with lectures about democracy and human rights from countries that are themselves supporting dictatorships when it's convenient. Now, I'm not here to tell you that Chinese economic influence is benevolent, or that these alternative systems will be more just or more democratic than the American-led order. That's not the point. The point is that the monopoly is breaking down. The unipolar moment, that brief period after the Cold War when the United States bestrode the world like a colossus with no rival capable of challenging its dominance, that moment is ending. And it's ending not primarily because of Chinese or Russian strength, though that's part of it, but because of American overreach, because of the arrogance that comes with unchallenged power, because of the assumption that the rest of the world would simply accept subordination indefinitely. The European Union is caught in a fascinating position in all of this. On one hand, Europe has been America's closest ally, the foundation of the Western alliance, deeply integrated into American-led institutions. On the other hand, European leaders are increasingly frustrated with American unilateralism, with being dragged into conflicts they didn't choose, with having their own economic interests sacrificed for American geopolitical goals. When Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions, European companies that had invested in Iran were forced to withdraw or face American penalties. European leaders seethed at this, at being treated not as allies, but as vassals. And they started talking seriously about creating independent payment channels, about reducing reliance on the dollar for intra-European trade, about building a more autonomous European foreign policy. The creation of INSTEX, the instrument in support of trade exchanges, was a direct response to American sanctions on Iran. It didn't work very well, it didn't process many transactions, but the fact that it was created at all was significant. It showed that even America's closest allies were thinking about alternatives, were willing to at least experiment with mechanisms that could bypass American financial control. That's a genie that doesn't go back in the bottle easily. What Trump feared most, if we're being analytical about it, wasn't actually a specific alternative currency or payment system. What he feared, what any American president would fear, is the loss of the exorbitant privilege that comes with dollar dominance, the ability to fund massive military spending without raising taxes, the ability to run persistent trade deficits without crisis, the ability to impose costs on adversaries without bearing significant costs yourself, the ability to borrow cheaply because the whole world needs your currency. That privilege has been the foundation of American power for half a century, and watching it erode, watching other countries build systems that don't depend on American approval or American infrastructure, that represents a fundamental threat to the entire model of American global dominance. And the tragedy, the real tragedy here, is that this didn't have to happen this way. If the United States had used its post-Cold War dominance to build a genuinely multilateral system, one that was fair and equitable, and that gave all countries a stake in its success, one that didn't weaponize finance and trade for narrow geopolitical gains, the dollar might have remained dominant for generations. But that's not what happened. Instead, we got expansion of NATO despite promises not to. We got wars in Iraq and Libya and Syria. We got support for coups in Ukraine and Venezuela and Bolivia. We got sanctions and regime change operations, and a general posture that communicated very clearly to the rest of the world that American power was not benevolent, not multilateral, but imperial and self-serving. So now here we are, watching the world reorganize itself, watching new alliances form, watching alternative institutions emerge, watching the slow but steady decline of American economic hegemony. And the question isn't whether this process can be stopped. It probably can't, not without fundamental changes to American policy that seem politically impossible right now. The question is, what comes next? What kind of world emerges from this transition? And whether that world will be more peaceful and more just than the one we're leaving behind? Those are open questions, and the answers will be determined by struggles and movements and decisions that haven't been made yet. But what's clear is that the era of unquestioned American dominance, the era when Washington could simply dictate terms to the rest of the world, that era is ending, and we're all living through the sometimes chaotic, sometimes dangerous, but ultimately inevitable transition to whatever comes next.